There was no sound in the courtroom. A pin could be heard dropping. The judge leaned forward, smirking, a tall, thin man with silver hair and a scowl that had been honed over decades. Judge Reginald Hanover was his name, and he had denigrated the elderly couple in front of him for years. Judge Hanover scoffed and adjusted his glasses, saying, "Let me get this straight. Have you also chosen to represent yourself in this case without a lawyer? An old couple who are likely still using flip phones and are unaware of the distinction between a sandwich and a subpoena." Everyone in the courtroom laughed. A smug man in a navy suit, the prosecutor smirked and folded his arms. Even the ostensibly impartial bailiff shook his head in laughter. The black old couple stood in silence. The husband just straightened his bow tie. He was an elderly man with thick spectacles and a cane. With a slight smile, his wife, whose silver curls were carefully tied into a bun, clasped her hands together. Judge Hanover had more work to do. This is not a religious baking sale. This is a courthouse. I advise you to accept defeat and stop making a fool of yourselves. You are facing experienced lawyers. You're not going to succeed. Laughter broke out in the courtroom. Individuals murmured to one another. The elderly man groaned and slowly cocked his head. "That's a rather strong opinion for someone who hasn't even allowed us to talk yet," he remarked quietly. His spouse gave a nod. "Yes, but we guess it's only right that we return the favor because you've chosen to make this personal." The elderly man removed his spectacles. The woman produced a stylish, leather-bound notebook from her luggage. She opened it and saw a sheet with clear, handwritten notes on it. They then straightened their postures and allowed their modest, kind faces to change into something angular in perfect harmony. The courtroom moved uncomfortably. Hanover, the judge, squinted. "What are you trying to do?" There was something odd about the elderly man's smile this time. Something hazardous. "Oh, nothing," he answered, his tone taking on a new significance. "Well, we were simply reminding you that we are lawyers. Not just any lawyers either." On the judge's bench, his wife laid a single sheet of paper. "Your Honor, you might want to read this before you keep making fun of us." Judge Hanover grabbed the document and quickly perused it. The color faded from his face. He opened his mouth in surprise. When they saw what was written on the page, everyone in the courtroom gasped. The couple's day had begun somewhat differently. When the mail arrived, Dr. Theodore and Dr. Amelia Barrington were in their comfortable home having a peaceful breakfast. Theodore, a retired law professor, had opened the package addressed to them after taking his time drinking his coffee. The letter, which came from the local courtroom, told them that Harold Langston, a wealthy developer, was suing them. The paper claimed that by refusing to sell their land, they were in violation of property laws. The Barringtons looked at each other. Amelia put down her teacup and remarked, "Looks like someone thinks they can bully us." "Thinks?" Theodore laughed. "They don't even know who they're dealing with, my dear." Before their discreet retirement, the couple had worked as leading lawyers for decades. Amelia was a tenacious civil rights lawyer who had successfully reversed unfair cases on her own, whereas Theodore had focused on corporate law and had destroyed dishonest billionaires. A trial had never been lost by them. In their final years, they had lived a modest life in their home, purposefully keeping a low profile. However, it seems that the world had chosen to put them to the test once more. The Barringtons also enjoyed a good challenge. A week later, they showed up in the courthouse looking like an old couple. Amelia was dressed in her favorite cardigan and floral outfit. Theodore brought his cane to complete the appearance of innocuousness, not because he needed it. They did not intend to make their identities known too quickly. They hoped to demonstrate the folly of their rivals. Judge Hanover was the instant manifestation of such folly. He had shown them complete contempt from the time they had walked into the courtroom. When they started talking, he interrupted. When the opposing attorney made fun of them, he grinned. And lastly, he erred by publicly denigrating them. That was the last of him. Amelia and Theodore had been quiet long enough. Judge Hanover continued to peruse the document in his hands while the courtroom sat in startled quiet. As he read the names, his fingers shook. Former Supreme Court lead lawyer Dr. Theodore Barrington. Dr. Amelia Barrington, the lawyer who made history by overturning 3 erroneous convictions on her own. Judge Hanover's lips dried up. The prosecutor, who had been so arrogant now, appeared as though he wanted to vanish. No longer just an old man with a cane and his lovely wife, the elderly pair stood erect. There was something different now, something strong. Theodore's head cocked. "So, Your Honor," he said easily, "should we move forward appropriately now?" The courtroom remained silent. For the first time in his career, Judge Hanover was at a loss for words. For what seemed like an age, the courtroom was silent. Judge Hanover's hands shook a little as he gripped the paper, his gaze flitting from the words to the two old people in front of him. He had just made fun of the same pair. In front of the entire courtroom, he had humiliated the same couple. They weren't just some ignorant old people stumbling through the judicial system. He discovered too late. They were legendary. Amelia Barrington and Theodore stood quietly, anticipating. They were neither angry nor arrogant. They had just transformed into their real selves, strong lawyers who had dedicated their lives to dismantling men just like Judge Hanover. Charles Whitman, the prosecutor, squirmed in his chair and coughed uncomfortably. The self-assurance he had shown minutes before was gone. He was aware that the case would be simple. The plaintiffs were merely an elderly couple, and the court was already in his favor. At least he had believed that. Hanover, the judge, cleared his throat. This? He had trouble coming up with the correct words. Nothing is altered by this. Theodore's lone eyebrow went up. Oh! With a slight smile on her lips, Amelia cocked her head. Your Honor, are you certain of that? The nostrils of Judge Hanover flared. He was aware that he was stuck. He would appear to have been purposefully biased if he gave in now. However, he ran the risk of further embarrassing himself if he kept making fun of them. The courtroom doors flew open before he could react. A man stormed in wearing a fancy suit. At last there was Harold Langston, the rich real estate developer who had brought the lawsuit. His briefcase swung wildly as he strode over to the prosecution's table, his face flushed with annoyance. How come it's taking so long? Langston let out a bark. This should have been finished in a matter of minutes. When he saw the Barringtons, he paused in the middle of his statement. They're just a couple of old. Theodore nodded slowly at him. Mr. Langston, good afternoon. Langston scowled. He was uneasy by the old man's speech for some reason. His tone conveyed conviction and confidence, as if he knew something Langston didn't. The prosecutor, Whitman, cleared his throat. There has been a development, Mr. Langston. Langston frowned. Developments are irrelevant to me. You are the one I recruited to win this case. As Amelia pushed another document across the table, he trailed off. These two are. Before assuming anything else, you might want to read this. Langston grabbed the paper and rapidly scanned it. His face went white. He glanced at the judge and then back to the paper. This is a joke, isn't it? He muttered. Judge Hanover said nothing. Langston's lips dried up. The entire career history of Theodore and Amelia Barrington was covered in depth in the publication. Every significant lawsuit they had won, every company they had destroyed, and every dishonest judge they had removed, including judges much like Reginald Hanover, were all recorded. Langston put the page down, his hand shaking. He felt hot all of a sudden, like if the walls were closing in about him. No, he said quietly to himself. This isn't possible. Amelia kept a careful eye on him. I think I've made a horrible error, is the phrase you're searching for. The audience in the courtroom had stopped laughing. A few murmured to one another. Others cast anxious looks toward the judge, unsure of what would come next. At last, Judge Hanover was able to speak. Harder than he had to, he smashed his gavel down. That's sufficient. I refuse to have this courtroom transformed into a circus. With a groan, Theodore adjusted his bow tie. Is it your courtroom? Amelia touched his arm tenderly. Dear, let's avoid getting ahead of ourselves. She grinned as she turned to face Judge Hanover. Your Honor, you appear agitated. It's almost as if you're becoming aware of the effects of what you've spoken. Hanover's expression grew gloomy. Mrs. Barrington, I am fully aware of the legislation. Barrington, Doctor, she made a seamless correction. Please pardon me, but it appears that you are completely unaware of nothing. There was a little gasp in the courtroom. Judge Hanover's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to such challenges, particularly from those he had just written off as unimportant. He gritted his teeth and replied, I propose that we move forward with the case. Amelia and Theodore looked at each other. Theodore then laughed. Go ahead, yes. Amelia gave a nod. Indeed. Shall we watch how this unfolds? They retreated to their table, their composed manner unaltered. The case was only getting started, but it was already obvious. It wasn't the Barringtons who needed to be scared. Like a hurricane on the verge of blowing, the tension in the courtroom was heavy and thick. In a desperate attempt to recover control of the situation, Judge Hanover rearranged his robes. He had a deep red face, but no one could tell if that was from embarrassment or fury. Charles Whitman, the prosecutor, squirmed uneasily in his chair. Harold Langston sat rigidly, his mouth tight, his eyes darting between the Barringtons and the judge as though seeking a way out. On the defense table, Theodore Barrington folded his hands carefully. All right, Your Honor, he said with ease. Let's move forward. We would rather not take up anyone's time. Amelia smiled slightly at her husband and then looked at the opposing counsel. Do you want to start, Mr. Whitman? Whitman cleared his throat. Indeed. Indeed, without a doubt. He took a time to gather his thoughts before continuing. Then he stood up and fixed his tie. He looked to the jurors. He started, ladies and gentlemen. He regained some of the confidence in his voice. This case is straightforward in its essence. Harold Langston and his development business, the plaintiffs, have been attempting to buy the defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Barrington, their land. However, the defendants have consistently stalled progress and refused to leave the property in spite of numerous legal notices, instead of engaging in reasonable negotiations. He hesitated, looking at the couple, anticipating a response. He received none. He went on, emboldened. The plaintiffs followed the text exactly. They have taken all the appropriate steps. Nevertheless, the defendants are unwilling to comply. This is about more than one piece of land in the end. It has to do with the law. He turned sharply in the judge's direction. The law must also be obeyed. Judge Hanover gave a nod of approval. I'm grateful, Mr. Whitman. Dr. Barrington now. He smirked as he turned to Theodore. Maybe you want to present your retort since you're so keen to defend yourselves? Theodore repositioned his spectacles. Oh, I would be overjoyed. He slowly got up from his chair, tapping his cane lightly on the ground. He nodded courteously to the jurors and then clasped his hands behind his back. He started, ladies and gentlemen. His voice was firm and rich. According to Mr. Whitman, this matter is straightforward, and I do concur, but maybe not the way he believes. A couple of the onlookers chuckled quietly. Theodore moved ahead a step. As you can see, neither my spouse nor I declined to engage in negotiations with Mr. Langston. In fact, within the past year, we had worked with his company several times. Additionally, we consistently expressed our disinterest in selling our property. He lifted an eyebrow in Langston's direction, and yet Mr. Langston chose to continue in spite of our blatant rejections. Langston folded his arms and scoffed. Theodore went on. According to the law, a person is not required to sell their land if they do not want to. He stopped and looked at the jurors. You all knew that, I suppose. A few jurors nodded and looked at each other. Theodore faced Judge Hanover once more. I'd want to provide Exhibit A as proof, Your Honor. Without a pause, Amelia retrieved a well-structured folder from her backpack and carried it to the bailiff. The judge scowled as he turned the pages after the bailiff gave it to him. What is this? Angrily, Hanover inquired. Theodore grinned. Oh, here's a quick reading for you. All of the legal infractions that Mr. Langston's company has done in their attempts to seize our land are what you're looking at, Your Honor. Judge Hanover's face grew serious. Theodore went on. Harassment, documents that are fraudulent, unauthorized zoning changes. My particular favorite is the attempted use of eminent domain, despite the fact that private development projects like his are expressly exempt from the law. The courtroom was filled with a murmur. Anger twisted Langston's face. This is absurd, he growled. We took all the necessary steps. That paperwork is meaningless. Amelia, who had stayed sitting, looked calmly at another folder. Oh dear, she thought. It does, in my opinion, have some significance. She produced a second piece of paper and held it up. Langston's horrified eyes grew wide. Theodore grinned. Do you realize that, Mr. Langston? Langston's face went pale white, and the courtroom fell silent. Next, Theodore faced the judge. This is an email from Mr. Langston's own legal team, Your Honor. They talk about strategies to get us to leave our house by manipulating the local zoning laws. Judge Hanover's face became white through illicit means. Whitman, the prosecutor, slumped in his chair, perspiration trickling down his forehead. The jury looked at each other in disbelief. Theodore was aware that the courthouse was falling apart. He returned to his seat slowly and took a seat. "Before we go any further, Your Honor," he remarked nonchalantly, "I would like to know exactly who is impeding the law." Langston struck the table with his fists. "This is absurd. You can't." "Watch yourself," Amelia warned calmly, Mr. Langston. Despite being kind, her words cut like a razor through the room. Langston stopped. The hands of Judge Hanover trembled. He cast glances at the jurors, the bailiff, and the onlookers. Everyone was observing him. He was out of control. He needed to take action. He gripped his gavel and clenched his jaw. "That's enough," he yelled, slamming onto the bench with such force that it sounded like a gunshot throughout the courtroom. Theodore was completely unconcerned and reclined back in his chair. Judge Hanover's nostrils flared as he inhaled deeply. He answered firmly, "I will review this evidence. The hearing has been postponed till further notice." Before anyone could stop him, he stormed out of the courtroom, slamming his gavel once more before standing up. The ensuing hush was deafening. Whitman quickly packed up his notes, clearly scared now. In contrast, Langston appeared to have swallowed a lemon entire. The onlookers started muttering. Amelia collected her papers with composure and packed them in her bag. Theodore gave her a quick glance and grinned a little. That was entertaining, he thought. Amelia laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, it's just getting started." Harold Langston gave them a stare so poisonous it might have melted steel as they got up to go. The Barringtons, however, just strolled by him. The first battle was already theirs. The war was only getting started. Theodore and Amelia Barrington walked through the courthouse hallways, which were alive with whispers. Their faces were composed, their steps deliberate. The same individuals who had previously made fun of them now exchanged curious looks, and occasionally terror. Judge Hanover had left abruptly. The prosecutor was trembling. They had revealed Harold Langston. However, Amelia sensed that this case was far from being resolved. A voice cried out behind them as they arrived at the courthouse exit. "Barrington, Dr. Barrington, Dr." They pivoted. It was the prosecutor, Charles Whitman. His forehead was sweating, and he had started a short jog to catch up with them. He panted, fiddling with his tie. I need to speak with you." An eyebrow was raised by Theodore. "What precisely is it about?" Whitman took a deep breath. "I was unaware of the zoning fraud." Amelia's head cocked. "Did you not?" He paused. His palms were rubbed together. "I chose this case because I believed it to be clear-cut. However, Langston never informed me that he was breaking local laws." Crossing his arms, Theodore kept a close eye on him. "And now you're aware?" Whitman let out a loud sigh. "I prevailed." The pair looked at each other. "Fascinating." Amelia whispered, "Why should we believe you?" "Exactly?" "Because Langston is hazardous," Whitman replied frantically. He lowered his voice and looked around anxiously. "You're not aware of his potential. You're wrong if you believe that he will roll over since you made him feel bad today. He wins." Theodore's eyes sparkled as he laughed. "We don't either." Whitman scowled. "You're not understanding. He is not a fair player, and I might end myself in the crossfire if I continue to represent him." After examining him for a while, Amelia let out a sigh. "Mr. Whitman, what do you want from us?" Whitman paused. I can leave the case now. I can submit a motion to resign as prosecutor if you put in enough effort." Theodore grinned. "How honorable of you. Tell me, though, are you doing honorably or terror?" Whitman moistened his mouth. "Is it important?" After giving it some thought, Theodore shook his head. "No, it doesn't, I guess." Amelia took out a business card from her purse and gave it to him. "You have 24 hours to submit that motion. We'll presume you've selected your side if you don't." Whitman regarded the card as though it were his only hope. Then he turned, nodded, and rushed down the corridor. Theodore let out a breath after observing him vanish. He is being honest. Langston isn't done yet. Amelia gave a nod. Then we ought to get ready. A chilly wind welcomed them as they went outside, but it wasn't the wind that made Amelia shudder. It was a sensation, a strong, innate caution. Desperate men did risky things, and Langston was furious. Later that night, the Barringtons sat in their comfortable living room, surrounded by bookshelves that held framed trophies, old legal texts, and artifacts from their decades-long courtroom struggles. Theodore stood by the window, watching the shadowy street outside their house, while Amelia sat on the couch, leafing through a thick legal binder. There was something wrong. Hear that? He whispered. Amelia looked up. What can you hear? He scowled. That's right. The neighborhood's typical noises. There was no sound of the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of children playing, or the rare passing car. It was too quiet on the street. Amelia put down her binder and got up. Do you believe someone is watching us? Theodore gripped his cane more tightly. We are, I'm sure. The porch light blinked at that moment. Outside, a shadow moved. After exchanging glances with Amelia, Theodore moved in the direction of the front entrance. He opened it a little, unlocked it, and froze. On their welcome mat was a solitary, immaculately white envelope devoid of a postal stamp. It had been hand-delivered. Theodore stooped to take it up, delicately opening it with his fingers. There was only one piece of paper inside. The words were written in bright, red ink. Or else drop the case. Amelia's eyes grew gloomy. How uncreative. With a sigh, Theodore placed the note on the coffee table. They must believe we are easily frightened. Amelia laughed. Shall we inform them of their error? The silence was broken by a loud collision before Theodore could respond. Glass was splintering on the floor after a rock was thrown through their living room window. Another letter was fastened around the rock. Picking it up, Theodore unfolded it and read the new message out loud. Final caution. For a minute, the couple stood silently. Then Amelia picked up her phoned, and stepped quietly over the glass. Hi, police? I want to report an incident, yes. Oh no, we're all okay. It was only a haphazard attempt at intimidation. She grinned. They will need to put in more effort than that. The broken glass on the floor of the living room was illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars as they passed the Barrington residence. Officers searched the area, making notes, taking pictures, and whispering to one another. One cop, a large, graying-haired man, stood with his hands on his hips and appeared unimpressed. Sergeant Miller was the name on his name tag. Miller scratched his chin and continued, Let me clarify. You stand here as if it were a small inconvenience when someone throws a rock through your glass and makes a few threats? Amelia sipped her tea while lounging in her recliner. Because, Sergeant, it's a little inconvenience. Theodore nodded as he leaned on his cane. We wouldn't just have a smashed window if the person who did this was sincere. Miller's eyes narrowed. With all due respect, Dr. Barrington, this kind of thing would shake most people. Amelia's eyebrow went up. The majority of people lack our experience. With a groan, the sergeant flipped over his notebook. Do you have any suspects? Theodore grinned. Well, we have a very accurate guess. Miller looked up. Langston? Amelia gave a nod. He does it that way. Indirect, cowardly, and unclear in terms of the law. Miller let out a breath via his nose. I'll be honest with you, but I can file a report and perhaps watch some surveillance footage from neighboring residences. This won't go very far without a witness or concrete proof. Theodore laughed. No worries, Sergeant. The law is not necessary to apprehend Langston. Miller scowled. The law is you. Amelia grinned. That's right. After examining them for a while, the sergeant shook his head. You two are unique. Theodore nodded slowly at him. We make an effort. Miller closed his notepad after making a few more notes. Okay, tonight, we'll patrol the area. But you call us if this gets out of hand. Amelia smiled sweetly. We will. Miller didn't seem persuaded. He looked at them for a moment, then signaled his officers to finish them. Theodore shut the door behind them as the final patrol car pulled off. His face was contemplative as he turned to face Amelia. They're afraid, he whispered. She gave a nod. So they're going to do something stupid, Theodore said. Excellent. They are therefore simpler to trap. Harold Langston slammed the door behind him as he ran into his office the following morning. Greg, his apprehensive young assistant, winced. Langston yelled, "Give me Whitman, please." Greg hesitated and tossed his briefcase onto his desk. "What about it, sir? I want results, not justifications." Langston lost his temper. Greg took a swallow. "The problem is that, sir. Whitman, he left the case, I guess." Langston stopped. "What?" Greg gave a brief nod. "Early this morning, he submitted the motion. It was approved by Judge Hanover. We no longer have a prosecutor." Langston twitched his eye. "The tiny weasel." With caution, Greg added, "There's more." He was rounded on by Langston. "More." Greg nervously tapped the screen of his phone as he held it up. It was reported by the media. The case is already the subject of a circulating article. The Barringtons are apparently well known in the legal community. Langston read the headline and grabbed the phone out of Greg's fingers. In a high-stakes legal dispute, a billionaire developer takes on legal titans. He clenched his fingers. The Barringtons' history, triumphs, and perfect record were all covered in depth in the article. People were calling him a coward and making fun of him in the comments. Langston's fists clenched. He had misjudged them. However, that error would not recur. He forced himself to relax and inhaled deeply. Then he looked across at Greg. "Find me another prosecutor. One without qualms. Someone who, under whatever circumstances, will prevail." Greg paused. "That could take a while, sir." Grabbing his assistant by the collar, Langston drew him in. "I have no time. Finish it." Greg nodded angrily and swallowed. After pushing him away, Langston wrote to Judge Hanover. "I would like to meet privately." Greg paused. "Is that permissible?" Langston grinned. "It will not be documented." Theodore flipped through an old case file in his study later that evening. Sitting opposite him, Amelia read in silence. Their phone buzzed with a notification. Amelia gave it a quick look. "Oh no, Langston is attempting to have a covert meeting with Judge Hanover." Theodore let out a sigh. "Predictable." She grinned. "Should we interrupt their small party?" Theodore laughed. "I assumed you wouldn't inquire." Taking hold of their coats, they ventured out into the darkness. The time has come to reverse the situation. Silently and with a clear goal, the Barringtons walked through the night like shadows. They had spent years perfecting the art of intelligence gathering, spotting secret meetings, exposing corruption, and outwitting influential people. And it would be the same tonight. Only the wealthiest and most influential people dared to congregate at the Monarch Club, a posh, exclusive salon where Judge Hanover's covert rendezvous with Harold Langston was scheduled to take place. A long time ago, during another high-stakes case, Theodore and Amelia had been there. They were familiar with the layout. They were familiar with the employees. Above all, they knew how to enter without being noticed. They were about to enter the club when they were stopped by a big, broad-shouldered bouncer. "Members only." Theodore grinned and straightened his bow tie. "Yes, I think the list includes our names." Clearly doubtful, the bouncer stared at them. "And who are you, exactly?" Amelia took out a small black card with gold lettering from her purse. The eyes of the bouncer grew wide. Even though it hadn't been used in years, the membership card was nonetheless respected in settings like this. The bouncer scowled, obviously at a loss for what to do. Then he sighed reluctantly and moved aside. "Greetings from the Monarch Club once again." With a courteous nod, the Barringtons entered. The club's interior was a fusion of dark wood, gold highlights, and subdued jazz music. The polished marble floors were softly lit by crystal chandeliers, and the walls were lined with plush velvet booths. It was the type of setting where influential men discussed topics they didn't want the public to know. Amelia and Theodore strolled through the club with ease, their presence undetectable. They saw him almost immediately. Harold Langston was seated across from Judge Hanover, who was drinking a glass of pricey scotch in a darkly lit corner booth. Langston was speaking in low, combative tones while bending forward. For his part, Judge Hanover appeared anxious, looking around the room as though he was aware that he was acting inappropriately. Theodore's arm was tapped by Amelia. "Come on, let's get closer." The pair slipped into a nearby table, far enough away to be invisible, but close enough to hear. Amelia laid her handbag on the table, cocking it to record every word with its tiny, inconspicuous recorder. Langston's voice was piercing and tinged with annoyance. "Hanover, you're losing control of the case." The judge tensed up. "I'm taking care of it." Langston laughed. "No, you're not. You looked foolish in your own courtroom because of those two relics." Judge Hanover's jaw tightened. "What are you looking for from me?" Langston leaned closer. "Please ensure that there is no trial in this matter." The judge paused. "That's challenging." Langston grinned. "If you play it correctly, no. The lawsuit should be dismissed on a technicality. Let's say they did not properly file something. Make it appear legitimate." The hands of Judge Hanover clenched around his glass. "I'm being asked to engage in judicial misconduct." Langston laughed. "I want to remind you of the person who initially placed you on that bench." Quiet. Amelia and Theodore looked at each other. Judge Hanover let out a harsh sigh. "I can't simply," Langston interrupted him, "work things out. I'll make sure you never sit on that bench again if you don't." Judge Hanover went pale. Langston got up. He was adjusting his pricey outfit. "Work hard, Hanover. Additionally, make sure those two lose." He turned and left after saying that, vanishing out the rear exit. Judge Hanover remained there for a long time, holding onto his glass as though it were his sole source of support. Then, very cautiously, he took his phone out of his jacket. He typed out a message while Theodore and Amelia looked on. Their own phone exploded a moment after that. Amelia gave it a quick look and grinned. She whispered that the court session was rescheduled. "He appears to be making a move." Theodore grinned. "Then we ought to create our own." They were prepared the following morning. The Barringtons showed up early at the courthouse, looking as sharp as ever. They could sense the tension as soon as they entered. Already seated at the bench, Judge Hanover avoided making eye contact. Harold Langston was sitting next to his new lawyer, a sleek, haughty man in a high-end suit who exuded corruption in every way. Then there came the actual courtroom. The onlookers, the attorneys, and even the clerks. The prior hearing had been publicized. They were now keeping a close eye on everything, anticipating what would come next. Hanover, the judge, cleared his throat. With scarcely a glance up, he declared, "We have a motion to dismiss the case, on the grounds that the defendant's submission was improper. I protest." Like a gunshot, Theodore's voice echoed across the courtroom. "Hanover," the judge recoiled. Theodore grinned. "Your Honor, before you proceed, the court could be interested in what I have." Then he took a tiny flash disc out of his suitcase. The face of Judge Hanover turned white. Amelia gave the bailiff the drive. "There's a recording of a pretty interesting conversation that happened last night at the Monarch Club," she added cheerfully. Langston straightened his posture. Amelia touched her lips with a finger and whispered, "You sure? Let's keep the surprise intact." The bailiff plugged the drive into the computer in the courtroom. Then the room was filled with Langston's voice. "The lawsuit should be dismissed on a technicality. Let's say they did not properly file something. Make it appear legitimate." Throughout the courtroom, there was a gasp. The hands of Judge Hanover trembled. Langston appeared to be about to blow up. Leaning forward, Theodore did. "Your Honor, this, in my opinion, makes it very evident that Mr. Langston has tried to influence the court." Amelia gave a charming smile. "What was that about throwing out our case, then?" Judge Hanover took a deep breath. Everyone had heard it, he realized as he looked around. The clerks, jurors, the legal assistants. It would be career suicide if he now took Langston's side. He took up his gavel with a trembling hand. "Move to dismiss." Rejected. The courtroom went silent in shock. Langston got up quickly. "You're a coward. You believe you can." The subsequent off-topic speaker. Judge Hanover lost his temper, humiliation blazing on his face. "Is going to be found in contempt." Langston's eyes were burning with rage, and his jaw tightened. The Barringtons did not panic. They finished their task for the day. The conflict had not ended. However, this conflict? It was their fight. The weight of Judge Hanover's grudging decision was still reverberating around the courtroom. At their dinner, Theodore and Amelia Barrington sat calmly. Despite their calm exteriors, they were aware that things had changed. Harold Langston's fingers dug into the wooden edge of the prosecutor's table, his face contorted in rage. Victor Prescott, his new lawyer, leaned down and whispered something in his ear. He was a cocky, shark-like man. Leaning back in his chair, Langston inhaled deeply and forced a sneer onto his lips. His rage had not subsided. Like a poisonous snake coiling for its next blow, it had just been contained. Still obviously shaken by the revelation of his covert encounter, Judge Hanover cleared his throat. With an unsteady voice, he declared that this court would meet again in 2 days. The matter will be handled as planned. Before anyone could utter another thing, he threw his gavel down and ran off the bench. There was a flutter of whispering in the courtroom. Amelia collected her papers gently. "That was good," she whispered. Theodore gave a nod. "It's not over, though." Both were aware that Langston wouldn't just give up easily. He was wealthy, powerful, and dangerously willing to break the law to achieve his goals. He was out for blood now. They got up to go when a voice interrupted them. "Do you believe you have one?" The mocking voice of Langston broke the clamor. The Barringtons pivoted. Langston approached them slowly and deliberately. A spooky smirk curved his lips. With a deceptively light voice, he said, "You embarrassed me in court today." It was an error. Theodore repositioned his spectacles. "Was it?" Langston shook his head and laughed. "You believe you've defeated me because you overheard a brief conversation? Do you suppose I'll be stopped by the law?" Amelia grinned. "Usually it does." Langston leaned a little closer. "Not now." Theodore's head cocked. "Well, Mr. Langston, that sounds almost like a threat." Langston smiled. "Yes, it is." Langston pivoted on his heel and stormed toward the exit, his lawyer following, before the bailiff could stop him. Amelia watched him leave. "He is in a grave situation." Theodore gave a nod. "He is dangerous because of that." The Barringtons were especially careful that evening. A strong man with too much money and too little patience had felt imprisoned in a similar situation previously. They were also aware that Langston was not yet done with them. While Amelia examined surveillance footage on her laptop, Theodore sat at his desk and flipped through their case files. Then their house phone rang shortly after midnight. Theodore scowled. "Oh, there are no calls on the home phone." Amelia turned off her computer. "Take caution." The receiver was hauled up by Theodore. "Hi there?" Quiet. Then a distorted, sluggish voice. "I told you." The line died. Theodore put the phone down slowly. Amelia's eyes narrowed. "He was that person?" Theodore gave a nod. "He's becoming uncontrollable." At that moment, there was a loud thump from outside. Immediately, Amelia stood up and walked to the window. Her keen eyes scanned the front yard as she looked through the drapes. Nothing. But suddenly Theodore joined her, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. He looked down at the porch. A little black box was resting in the middle of their welcome mat. Neither of them made a move. Evidence of the atrocities committed by a corrupt governor had been included in the previous unmarked parcel they had received. But this time, they thought it might be something much darker. Taking her phone, Amelia called Sergeant Miller. "We are in a predicament." Police vehicles around the Barringtons' house, once more 15 minutes later. Squatting on the porch, Sergeant Miller looked cautiously at the black box. Two policemen stood close by, awaiting orders. Miller let out a sigh. "I detest such things." An officer gave a nod. "Do you want the bomb squad called in?" Amelia's eyebrow went up. "Is Harold Langston truly brave enough to employ explosives, in your opinion?" Miller gave her a glance. "When it comes to strong, resentful males, I don't make any assumptions." Theodore gave his cane a contemplative tap. "Crack it open." Miller scowled. "Are you certain?" Theodore gave a nod. Miller gingerly raised the lid, his face wary. There was only one thing inside. A picture. Picking it up, Miller flipped it over. He hardened his face at the sight of it. Amelia took it from him. Her gut twisted after just one glance. She and Theodore were in the picture, captured outside the courthouse that very morning. Red ink was used to scribble the message across the photograph. "They're watching you." There was silence among the gathering. Sergeant Miller let out a long sigh. He rubbed his forehead and mumbled, "All right. It's personal now." Theodore held the camera between his fingers as he took the picture. Amelia's eyes shifted to her husband. "He tries to frighten us?" Theodore grinned. "Then we will let him down." Miller's face grew serious. "Both of you require protection." Theodore gave a head shake. "We require a counteroffensive." Amelia crossed her arms. "Langston believes he is invincible." Let's demonstrate that he isn't. Miller let out a sigh. I don't like the direction this is taking. Theodore grinned. Then you might want to turn your head away. They were tired of playing defense. Now was the moment to attack. The Barringtons were already on the move the morning after the late-night threat. They had spent decades outwitting the most dangerous players in the legal game, exposing dishonest officials and destroying corrupt corporations. Harold Langston believed that he was invincible. He was going to find out how mistaken he was. Theodore was sitting at his desk, searching for patterns with his fingertips as he skimmed over old case files. Sitting gracefully on the couch, Amelia was looking through court documents, commercial transactions, and property records related to Langston's company on her laptop. Then she discovered it. She swiveled the laptop in Theodore's direction. I believe I have something, darling. He leaned closer. A number of land purchases made in Langston's name were shown there. Amelia, however, was drawn to one. Judge Reginald Hanover approved a housing project in half the time it normally takes. A gentle smile curved Theodore's lips. Hanover, this is so much easier now because of you. Before their lawsuit, Langston had obviously been bribing Hanover. They now had evidence. Amelia shut down the computer. Let's place him in a situation from which he cannot get out. Theodore called that afternoon. Hi there. Dr. Barrington is here. Smoothly, he said. A press conference is something I would like to arrange. A dozen reporters gathered outside the courthouse that evening. Mics up, cameras flashing. The new threats against the Barringtons only increased public interest in the issue, which was already generating a lot of noise in the legal world. Theodore and Amelia came forward at exactly 6 o'clock. Amelia was the first to speak. Good evening, she said in a composed yet strong tone. Justice is what my husband and I have devoted our lives to. Regretfully, it appears that some people think they are above the law. The crowd echoed with murmurs. Theodore went on. In addition to trying to scare us, Harold Langston and his colleagues have been involved in illicit activities behind the scenes. Shocks. The reporters hung on to every word as they leaned in. A folder was held up by Theodore. We have information in this file that connects Langston to fraudulent land purchases. The flash of cameras grew louder when Judge Reginald Hanover personally gave his approval. Amelia took over. We will no longer tolerate this corruption. First thing in the morning, we will formally file a judicial complaint against Judge Hanover. The reporters were inundated with inquiries. Do you mean that the judge has been bought off? How is Langston going to be dealt with? Did you get any additional threats? Amelia smiled slightly, knowingly. We are more than willing to play if Mr. Langston wants to carry on with his games. Excitement erupted as the press conference came to a close. The Barringtons had just made their most overt declaration of war against Langston. Harold Langston sat at his desk in a darkened office and watched the news conference. He balled his hands into fists. His lawyer, Victor Prescott, turned to him. You're being humiliated by them. Langston's mouth clenched. He snarled, I don't care about humiliation. Winning is important to me. Prescott's arms were folded. With that proof, Hanover is done. Langston let out a loud sigh. Then we have to hurry. His gaze grew gloomy. I want to get rid of the Barringtons. Give a call. Prescott paused. Harold, right now. With a groan, Prescott took out his phone. Amelia and Theodore sat in their study that evening, reviewing the day's activities. They had successfully played their hand. Langston was defensive because the media was consuming it. Still, something didn't feel right. Amelia put her book down. Theodore nodded and said, You feel it too. Langston is not the kind to just sit back and accept defeat. Just like clockwork, their phone rang. It was picked up by Theodore. Speaking is Dr. Barrington. On the other end growled a deep, strange voice. They warned you. Click. The line died. Theodore rubbed his temples and let out a breath. Then swam. There was a gunshot. The silent night was broken by the sound. Amelia jumped up quickly. Theodore. The pair hurried over to the window. At the boundary of their land stood a shadowy figure. A gun went up, pointed straight at them. There was another shot. A piece of glass broke. The living room was filled with rain. Grabbing Amelia, Theodore dragged her behind the couch. More shots. The wood broke. Books fell from the shelves. Then there was quiet. They continued to listen while crouching. Steps. Faint. Then vanishing into the darkness. Amelia let out a loud sigh. He's becoming worse. Theodore's expression remained unwavering. Then we also escalate. They'd spent enough time playing defense. It was time to put an end to this. The air was heavy with the smell of gunpowder. With caution, Theodore walked around the broken window, the glass crunching beneath his feet. The night was dead silent outside. The person who had fired the rounds had disappeared into the night. However, one thing was evident. Harold Langston was no longer a gamer. Amelia let out a quiet breath while still hunched over the couch. Despite the close call, her pulse remained steady. "My dear," she whispered. She stood, fiddling with her blouse. "I think our opponent just committed a serious error." Theodore grinned. "Yes." The main door resonated with a forceful knock. After exchanging glances, Theodore approached with a cautious gait. He opened the door and looked through the peephole. Sergeant Miller stood with a gloomy expression on his face. Behind him, a bunch of cops. Miller said, "Tell me," and entered. "Have you ever had a quiet night?" Theodore laughed. "Not recently." Miller looked over the wreckage. The walls were covered in bullets. The shattered glass. This wasn't just a random break-in. Is that correct? Amelia folded her arms. "No. There was a message." Miller let out a sigh. "I assume you don't have any security footage." Amelia pointed to a tiny but sophisticated security camera installed in the room's corner. "We are always ready." Miller gave his officers a nod. "Obtain that video. I'd like a thorough analysis." As one of the officers began photographing the damage, another carefully removed the security disc. Miller looked back at the pair. "Don't you understand what's going on here?" Theodore repositioned his spectacles. "Langston is becoming desperate." Miller gave a head shake. "More than desperate. He is the most dangerous kind of man because he has backed himself into a corner." Amelia drummed her arm with her fingers. "What are you going to do, Sergeant?" Miller wiped his face with his hand. "I want both of you to leave this house until we find out who is responsible." "Anyway," Theodore grinned. "Yes, we are already aware." Miller scowled. "You believe you know, but before we can make an arrest, we must prove it." Amelia's head cocked. "Sergeant, you don't comprehend. We don't require evidence. All we need is leverage." Miller let out a grunt. "The sound of that bothers me." Theodore gave him a shoulder clap. "Then you might want to get out of there." The security footage was examined an hour later. A masked man was seen on camera slinking into the Barringtons' land, brandishing his weapon and shooting before vanishing inside a black SUV. However, one important element was noticeable. The license plate was captured by the camera as the gunman ran away. Leaning in, Miller read the numbers. His gaze expanded. "I'll be damned, then." Amelia grinned. "Sergeant, please share." Miller gave a quick exhale. "That SUV belongs to Langston's business." There was silence in the room. Miller faced his officers. "Obtain an arrest warrant for me. Right now." Harold Langston, on the other hand, was sitting in his penthouse office across town, drinking a pricey whiskey and tapping his fingers on the desk. His cell rang. Before answering, he took a quick look at the caller ID. "Is it finished?" A pause. A voice on the other end then. "Something is wrong." Langston's hold became more firm. "What sort of issue is it?" The plate was given to them. "The police are after you." Langston's expression grew gloomy. His glass almost broke when he slammed it down. His lawyer, Victor Prescott, looked up from the corner of the office. "The news is bad." Langston glared at him. "Quit talking." He returned his attention to the phone. "Pay attention to me. Make this right. How does it matter to me?" The line died. Langston tightened his teeth and let out a breath. The legal battle had been won by the Barringtons. He was the one being pursued after attempting to frighten them. He wasn't going down by himself, though. "Prescott." He lost his temper. The lawyer bent forward. "Indeed?" Something evil glittered in Langston's eyes. "We're setting everything on fire." Miller's phone rang at the Barringtons' house. In a matter of seconds, his look changed from one of satisfaction to one of anxiety as he moved aside to answer the phone. He looked back at Amelia and Theodore. "We're having trouble." Theodore's cane was modified. "One more?" Miller's mouth clenched. "Langston is taking action. Large ones." We recently learned that he is hiding his tracks, wiping records, and moving all of his assets. Amelia's eyebrow went up. That is, he's getting ready to run. Miller gave a nod, and he will vanish if he does. No trial, no fairness. Theodore's eyes became piercing. We then forbid him from running. Amelia grinned. I do think checkmate is in order. Miller let out a sigh. Okay, what is the strategy? Theodore grinned. Oh, it's easy. He looked across at Amelia. Shall we set a trap, darling? Amelia laughed. Well, let's. They had previously lured men like Langston. It was time to get rid of him. They had a plan. The Barringtons had had enough of the game. It was time to ensure that Harold Langston was unable to flee. Amelia and Theodore had been planning for hours, making connections and carefully outlining every move. They were aware that Langston was a man motivated by money, conceit, and power, and he would fail because of those flaws. Theodore said, "We'll hit him where it hurts most." The study's pace, his fortune. Leaning on the wall was Amelia. Folded arms. Langston has already deceived the individuals he trusts the most. We've observed that in his behavior. If it will save him, you will put anyone under the bus. Theodore gave a nod. That's right. We'll provide him the information he doesn't anticipate. We'll make sure that his illicit land deals, secret assets, and connections to Hanover are widely reported by the media. Not even Langston will be able to conceal the light we emit. Then, Amelia said, we must make him believe that we have failed. Make him believe that he has won. You want to hurry. We can trap him with that desperation. She looked at her spouse. There was a flash of resolve in her eyes. You're correct. If he believes he can escape, he will flee. He always does. And we'll be prepared when he tries. The Barringtons gave the media access to a number of meticulously selected files the following morning. They had included Hanover's involvement, Langston's private papers, and proof of his illicit land transactions. A date on the files demonstrated the extent of Langston's wrongdoing, the covert deals, and the millions he had transferred through shell corporations. The fallout was instantaneous by the time the news reached the public. Within hours, Langston's world fell apart. Stories regarding his dubious activities, corrupt relationships, and connections to a judge who had been influenced by money had been widely circulated by the media. There were a lot of calls for his arrest. Langston tried to relocate his assets right away in a panic, hiding his tracks wherever he could. Prescott, his lawyer, was working feverishly to prevent the media from gaining further access to Langston's financial documents. However, it was too late. Already, the story was going viral. As Langston's kingdom started to fall apart in front of his eyes, Amelia and Theodore watched. They wasted no time at all, and before long, all of the banks Langston had dealt with were pulling away from him. They frozen bank accounts. They confiscated his properties. He was confined. Theodore replied in a calm but eager tone, Langston is about to make his move. Let's confirm that we are in the right position. Amelia gave a nod. He will run. They always do. Langston was too smart to wait for the police to come to his house. He took a last-ditch action as the walls closed in on him. Being discovered with his assets still linked to his name was the last thing he wanted. Langston's jet was being prepared for flight in the dead of night. He had a private jet waiting to take him to a nation where extradition would not be able to reach him. He already had Prescott with him, finalizing the preparations. They were heading out. However, they hadn't taken anything into consideration. A lone black SUV arrived at the private runway as the jet's engines came to life, preventing the aircraft from taking off. Langston felt his heart pounding. His cheeks reddened with panic as he exited the aircraft. What is this? The SUV doors opened, and Amelia and Theodore Barrington got out. Mr. Langston, Theodore remarked icily, we thought you'd be leaving. However, it appears that you have overlooked something. Langston stepped back. Why are you here? Amelia said in a low, threatening voice. Our goal is to prevent you from getting away with it. Dozens of police officers surrounded Langston's jet as a police convoy reached the bend and parked up behind the Barringtons' SUV. Sergeant Miller came forward and said, You're under arrest, Mr. Langston. As Langston was placed in handcuffs, his face turned pale. This is not possible. You're making a grave error. With his cane thumping lightly on the floor, Theodore took a step forward. Langston, you created your own error. You're going to pay for it now. Despite Langston's efforts, the officers tightened their grip. Prescott attempted to step in, but was hurled out of the way. Theodore looked at Amelia as they loaded Langston into the police car. We succeeded. Amelia grinned. We went beyond that. We saw to it that justice was done. The last phase of the Barringtons' conflict with Harold Langston was over. Stories of his arrest, his wealth being taken, and his crooked activities being made public erupted in the media. Judge Hanover was also being investigated. The very greed he had permitted to grow had damaged his career. However, the Barringtons did not celebrate their triumph. They had fulfilled their obligations. No more, no less. After all, they were attorneys, and they had just carried out their duties. Theodore breathed softly as he stared out the window as the sun sank behind them as they went home that evening. Haven't we been through a lot? Amelia gave a little laugh. Although it's never simple, it's always worthwhile. Squeezing her hand, Theodore reached over. Amelia smiled and repeated, "To justice, to justice." The Barringtons then resumed their peaceful lives, content that the system they had battled so hard to establish had been restored, at least temporarily. Although the battle was finished, their influence would last for years in the legal community.